Coming home after a long stint at sea always stirs up a jumble of emotions. You'd expect it to be mostly relief, maybe even joy, but this time, it felt different. I had been away for months navigating the stormy seas, doing my job as the captain, and now finally I was craving the comfort of my own bed, my wife's cooking, and the peace of solid ground beneath my feet. But the moment I stepped through the door, something felt off. My wife greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a little too wide, a little too forced, and my stepson, Tom, was distant, almost cold. After spending so much time away, relying on letters and the occasional phone call to keep in touch, you learn to read people. And right then, their behavior didn't add up. As I dropped my bags, I could feel their eyes on me, watching every move I made. The house looked the same, smelled the same, but there was this invisible tension hanging in the air, something I couldn't ignore. Jessica usually couldn't stop talking when I came back, sharing every little detail about what had happened while I was gone. But today, her words felt rehearsed, as if she was trying to cover up an uncomfortable silence. Tom, sitting on the couch, barely even looked up from his phone when I walked in. He gave me a half-hearted wave before turning right back to his screen. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was just tired, maybe overthinking things. After all, I had just returned from months at sea. But dinner that night only made it worse. Jessica had cooked my favorite, roast chicken and mashed potatoes, but something felt off. She kept glancing at Tom like she was waiting for something. Her nervousness was palpable. Tom, on the other hand, was unusually quiet, only speaking when directly spoken to. It felt like I was an outsider in my own home, like they had adjusted to a new way of living while I was away, and my return was more of an inconvenience than a reason to celebrate. The conversation was stiff, and whenever I tried to talk about my time at sea, Jessica quickly changed the subject, as if she couldn't bear to let me remind them of where I'd been. After dinner, I decided to have a chat with Tom. I asked him if he had any plans to move out soon. At 25, with a decent job and no real reason to stay at home, most young men would be eager for their own space. But Tom just shrugged it off. He said it was easier living at home, that he liked the convenience. His answer took me by surprise. Not just the words themselves, but the way he said them. Like he had been expecting the question. Like he had rehearsed it. It wasn't the answer of someone who genuinely enjoyed staying at home. It was the answer of someone hiding something. That night, as I lay in bed next to Jessica, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the day in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. Every smile, every glance, every word felt loaded with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. I wanted to ask Jessica what was going on, confront her about the strange atmosphere in the house, but I couldn't find the right words. I didn't want to start a fight on my first night back, so I stayed quiet, hoping it was just me overthinking things. Maybe after a few days everything would go back to normal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't going to. The next morning, things didn't improve. Jessica was up early, already dressed and ready to go. She told me she had errands to run, needed to pick up a few things from the store. Tom was nowhere to be found, and when I asked about him, she just shrugged and said he had gone out. There was something in her voice that set off alarms. She was trying too hard to sound casual. I offered to go with her, thinking it would be nice to spend some time together after being apart for so long, but she insisted I stay home and rest. That was unlike her. Normally, she'd jump at the chance to be together, but this time she wanted me out of the way. My suspicions grew. I spent the day trying to ease back into my old routines, but everything felt different. I went out to the garage to tinker with some old tools, hoping the familiar task would calm my mind. But even there, I felt uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed while I was gone, that the life I thought I was coming home to wasn't the same anymore. I tried to convince myself it was just the usual readjustment after being away so long, but every time I saw Jessica or Tom, how they avoided eye contact, how they tiptoed around me, it only confirmed my growing sense that something was very wrong. That evening I went for a walk, hoping the fresh air would help clear my head. I kept thinking about Tom. He had always been a good kid, polite and respectful, but there had always been a distance between us, a barrier I'd never been able to break down. He wasn't my biological son, Jessica had him from a previous relationship, but I'd always tried to be a father figure to him. Lately, though, it felt like he was pulling away, like there was something he didn't want me to see. I couldn't help but wonder if, in my absence, he had grown closer to Jessica in a way that excluded me. The thought made my stomach churn, but I couldn't ignore it. By the time I returned home, it was dark. Jessica was in the living room, watching TV, and Tom was still out. I sat down next to her, trying to find the words to express what I was feeling. I wanted to ask her if everything was okay, if there was something she wasn't telling me. But when I looked at her, at the way she smiled at me, I couldn't do it. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and it made the knot in my chest tighten. I knew whatever was going on, I'd have to figure it out on my own. I couldn't just sit back and pretend everything was fine. Not this time. In the weeks after my return, I started noticing a strange pattern. It began with little things. Jessica would ask me to run errands, pick up something from the store, or drive across town for a specific item. At first, I thought nothing of it. She was probably just trying to make my return easier, giving me simple tasks to handle. But before long, it became clear this wasn't just an occasional request. It was happening almost every day. There was always something urgent, something that needed to be done, and it was always when Tom was home. Jessica would make these errands sound important, as if they couldn't wait. "You're so much better at picking out the right produce," or "I don't trust myself to pick the right nails for that project. You know what we need." Her words were always accompanied by that same warm smile, but there was a hollowness to it that I couldn't ignore. I told myself it was just her way of keeping things in order. She liked knowing everything was being done properly, but something about the timing, the way she seemed almost relieved when I said I'd go, gnawed at me. One Saturday afternoon, she asked me to go to the hardware store to pick up some paint for the guest bedroom. She needed a specific shade of blue, one she'd seen online. Of course, I agreed. There was no reason not to. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Why did it always have to be me? Why couldn't Tom go instead? He had a car, he had free time. It wasn't like he had any real responsibilities. The more I thought about it, the more it hit me. Every time Jessica asked me to leave, Tom was always conveniently around. It seemed like she was actively finding ways for them to be alone together. The errands themselves weren't difficult. Most of the time, they were things I could have knocked out in half an hour, but the sheer frequency of them began to wear on me. I'd come home to find Tom and Jessica sitting in the living room, laughing over some joke I wasn't in on. It wasn't that they were doing anything obviously wrong, not on the surface at least, but there was something off about the way they'd go quiet when I walked in. Jessica would quickly jump up, pretending to be busy with something else, and it always made my stomach twist. It felt like I was interrupting something, even though I couldn't quite pinpoint what. I tried to shake the thoughts. I really did. I wanted to believe that Jessica was just being practical, that she honestly thought I was better suited for the errands. She'd always praised my attention to detail, how I could pick out the ripest fruit or find exactly what we needed for a project around the house. But even that started to feel like a convenient excuse, a reason to send me away whenever Tom was home. I didn't want to believe my wife was purposely trying to push me out, but the signs were piling up, and I couldn't ignore them. One day, I decided to test my theory. Jessica had asked me to go to the pharmacy to pick up a prescription, something she claimed was urgent. I said I'd go, but then I lingered in the driveway, pretending to check something in the car. Through the window, I could see Jessica and Tom in the kitchen. As soon as she thought I was gone, her whole demeanor shifted. She relaxed, leaned against the counter, and smiled at Tom in a way that made my chest tighten. It wasn't anything overtly suspicious, but it was enough to confirm the unease I'd been feeling. They were more comfortable when I wasn't around. I drove to the pharmacy with a heavy knot in my chest, my mind racing. Was I just imagining things, or was there something more going on between them? I tried to remember if things had been like this before, back when I was home more. Had I just missed the signs? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't remember the last time Jessica looked at me the way she looked at Tom, with that easy warmth and familiarity. It made me feel like a stranger in my own home, like I was the one intruding on their lives. Over the next few weeks, I found myself growing more resentful. Every time Jessica asked me to run an errand, that familiar frustration bubbled up inside me. I wanted to refuse to stay home just to see how she'd react, but I didn't. I didn't want to start a fight or accuse her of something I couldn't prove. So I kept doing what she asked, all the while feeling the distance between us grow wider. I started dreading coming home, knowing there would be more excuses and more reasons for me to leave. It was exhausting, and I was starting to lose my grip on what was real. One evening, after yet another errand that had me running across town for something trivial, I decided I'd had enough. I needed answers. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, couldn't keep ignoring what was right in front of me. As I stood in the kitchen, watching Jessica laugh at something Tom had said, I realized I had to know the truth, no matter what it cost me. I couldn't keep living like this, always on the outside, looking in. Even though I was scared of what I might find, I knew I couldn't just turn a blind eye anymore. It was a Saturday morning when I decided to do some cleaning around the house. Jessica had gone out for groceries, and I figured I might as well make myself useful and tackle a few of the bigger chores. Tom was still asleep, and it had been a while since anyone had given his room a proper clean. I figured it wouldn't hurt to tidy up a bit, vacuum, straighten things out. I'd always believed in keeping the house in order. It was my way of maintaining control, especially after long stints away at sea. As I moved through the house, dusting and organizing, I found myself standing in front of Tom's door, ready to tidy up his room. The room was the usual mess you'd expect from a young guy: clothes piled up on a chair, an unmade bed, scattered electronics on the desk. I sighed, shaking my head, and got to work. I started by picking up the dirty clothes, bending down to grab a stray sock near the bed. And that's when I noticed something out of place. There, tucked under the bed, was a piece of fabric that didn't belong. I reached under and pulled it out, my stomach sinking when I realized what I was holding. It was a pair of women's underwear, and not just any pair. It was Jessica's. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at it, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Why the hell were Jessica's underwear under Tom's bed? The more I tried to come up with a logical explanation, the more unsettled I felt. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood there, holding that piece of clothing like a physical symbol of something I didn't want to acknowledge. It was one thing to suspect something was off, to feel like secrets were being kept from me. But this was different. This was tangible evidence, something I couldn't just brush off as a bad feeling. I knew I had to ask Tom about it. Coming home after being away for a while is always a strange mix of emotions. You'd think it would mostly be relief and happiness. But this time, something felt different. I had been away for months, navigating turbulent waters as the captain of a ship, and I was ready for the familiar comforts of my own bed, my wife's cooking, and the peace of being on solid ground. But the moment I walked through the front door, I could sense something was off. Jessica greeted me with a smile that looked forced, almost too cheerful, and Tom was oddly distant. You learn to read people when you spend so much time away, relying on letters and phone calls to maintain relationships. Something about their behavior didn't add up. As I set down my bags, I could feel their eyes on me, watching my every move. The house smelled the same. Everything was just as I had left it. Yet there was a tension in the air that I couldn't ignore. Jessica usually couldn't stop talking when I came back from a voyage, filling me in on every little thing that had happened while I was away. But today her words felt rehearsed, almost like she was trying to fill a silence she was afraid of. Tom was sitting on the couch, eyes glued to his phone. He barely looked up when I walked in, offering me only a half-hearted wave before returning to his screen. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just tired, that maybe I was overthinking it. After so long at sea, I figured I just needed time to adjust. Dinner that night was another strange experience. Jessica had cooked my favorite meal, roast chicken with mashed potatoes. But there was something about the way she kept glancing at Tom that caught my attention. She seemed almost nervous, like she was waiting for something to happen. Tom, on the other hand, was unusually quiet, only speaking when spoken to. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was an outsider in my own home, like they had gotten used to a different way of living while I was gone, and my return was more of an inconvenience than a relief. The conversation felt stiff, and every time I tried to bring up my time at sea, Jessica quickly changed the subject, as though she didn't want me to talk, didn't want to remind them of where I had been and what I had been doing. After dinner, I decided to have a word with Tom. I asked him about his plans if he was thinking about moving out anytime soon. He was 25 now, with a decent job that paid well enough. Most young men his age would be eager to live on their own, but Tom just shrugged, saying living at home was easier, that he liked the convenience. His response caught me off guard. It wasn't just what he said, but the way he said it, like he had already rehearsed the answer, like he knew I was going to ask. It wasn't the answer of someone who genuinely wanted to stay. It was the answer of someone who had something to hide. That night, as I lay in bed next to Jessica, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the day in my head, trying to make sense of it all. Every smile, every glance, every word felt loaded with meaning that I couldn't quite grasp. I wanted to ask Jessica what was going on, to confront her about the strange feeling in the house, but I couldn't find the right words. I didn't want to start a fight on my first night back, so I kept quiet, hoping that maybe I was just imagining things, that maybe after a few days, everything would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. The next morning, things didn't get any better. Jessica was up early, already dressed and ready to go. She said she had errands to run, that she needed to pick up a few things from the store. Tom was nowhere to be seen, and when I asked about him, she just shrugged and said he had gone out. There was something in her tone that made me uneasy, like she was trying too hard to sound casual. I offered to come along with her, thinking it would be nice to spend some time together after being apart for so long, but she insisted that I stay home and rest. It was unlike her to turn down time together, and it only made my suspicions grow. I spent the day trying to settle back into my routines, but everything felt different. I went to the garage to tinker with some old tools, hoping that the familiarity of fixing things would help ease my mind. But even there, I felt uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in my absence, that the life I thought I was coming back to wasn't the same anymore. I tried to tell myself it was just the usual adjustment period, that I was reading too much into things. But every time I saw Jessica or Tom, the way they avoided eye contact, the way they seemed to walk on eggshells around me, it only confirmed what I feared. Something was wrong. That evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. As I walked, I found myself thinking about Tom again. He had always been a good kid, polite and respectful, but there was a distance between us that I had never been able to bridge. He wasn't my biological son. Jessica had him from a previous relationship, but I had tried my best to be a father figure to him. Lately, though, it felt like he was pulling away, like there was something he didn't want me to see. I couldn't help but wonder if my being away for so long had given him a chance to grow closer to Jessica in a way that excluded me. The thought made my stomach turn, but I couldn't ignore it. By the time I got back home, it was already dark. Jessica was in the living room watching TV, and Tom was still out. I sat down next to her, trying to find the right words to express what I was feeling. I wanted to ask her if everything was okay, if there was something she wasn't telling me. But when I looked at her, the way she smiled at me, I couldn't do it. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and it only made the knot in my chest tighten. I knew that whatever was going on, I had to find out for myself. I couldn't just sit back and pretend everything was fine, not this time. In the weeks following my return, I began to notice a peculiar pattern. It started with little things. Jessica would ask me to run to the store for something we had run out of, or she'd need me to pick up a specific item from a shop across town. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured she was just trying to make my transition back to normal life easier by giving me simple tasks to handle. But after a while, it became clear it wasn't just occasional requests. It was happening almost every day. There was always something that needed picking up, something urgent that required me to leave the house, and it was always during times when Tom was home. Jessica had a way of making the errands seem important, almost as if they couldn't wait. She'd smile and say, "You're so much better at picking out the good produce," or, "I don't trust myself to get the right kind of nails for that project. You know what we need." Her words were always accompanied by that same smile, warm but somehow hollow. I told myself it was just her way of keeping things organized, that she liked knowing everything was being done right. But there was something about the timing, about the way she seemed almost relieved when I said I'd go, that gnawed at me. One Saturday afternoon, Jessica asked me to go to the hardware store to pick up some paint. She claimed she wanted to repaint the guest bedroom and needed a specific shade of blue she had seen online. I agreed, of course. I didn't have any reason not to. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why did it always have to be me? Why couldn't Tom go instead? He had a car. He had free time. It wasn't like he had any major responsibilities keeping him busy. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that every time Jessica asked me to leave the house, Tom was always conveniently around. It was like she was trying to create opportunities for them to be alone together. The errands themselves weren't difficult. Most of the time, they were things I could have handled in half an hour. But the frequency of them started to wear on me. I'd come home to find Jessica and Tom sitting together in the living room. I kept running into walls. I couldn't figure out how to get through to Jessica, or Tom for that matter. The more I tried to confront them, the more they closed up, dismissing my concerns like I was just being paranoid or unreasonable. It was like I didn't have a place in this house anymore, not just physically, but emotionally. I kept thinking about what I'd found in Tom's room, Jessica's underwear. I kept replaying the look on Tom's face when I confronted him. That quick recovery, that rehearsed tone. I knew he was lying. And Jessica, when I tried to talk to her, she dismissed me like I was overreacting. The frustration of not being taken seriously was crushing. The next few days felt like I was walking around in a fog. I was stuck in this strange limbo, neither here nor there. Every time I tried to engage with Jessica, she seemed to slip away. Every time I looked at Tom, I felt this cold distance between us. I had come back hoping for comfort and warmth, but instead I found a place that felt unfamiliar, even hostile. I couldn't help but feel like an outsider in my own home. I spent more time alone, avoiding Jessica and Tom as much as I could. It was easier that way. At least when I was alone, I didn't have to pretend like everything was normal. But deep down, I was spiraling. I kept asking myself, what was I missing? I kept wondering if it was my fault, if I had been away too long, if I had neglected them, if I had somehow failed them as a husband and a father. But the truth was, I had no answers, only more questions. I couldn't ignore what I had seen, the way Jessica and Tom looked at each other, the way they acted when I wasn't around. It all pointed to something I didn't want to believe, but every little piece of evidence, every strange behavior, seemed to confirm my worst fears. They were keeping something from me, and I was the last to know. I couldn't keep avoiding it, though. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I had to confront them, not just for my sake, but for the sake of whatever was left of this family. I just didn't know if I was ready to hear the answers. I was starting to feel shut out, kept in the dark. That night as I lay in bed next to her, I couldn't ignore the cold distance that had crept between us. It wasn't something that had been there before, and I didn't know what to make of it. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the growing gap, but I had no idea how. Every time I tried to talk about what was bothering me, she would twist things around, somehow making me feel like I was the one stirring up problems where there were none. It left me feeling isolated, like I was living in a house full of people who didn't want me to know the truth. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, my mind couldn't stop replaying the events of the day. I tried to make sense of it all, but I knew deep down that nothing would change if I kept letting things slide. I needed answers, and if Jessica and Tom weren't going to give them to me willingly, I'd have to figure out another way. The uneasy feeling I had carried since getting home had only grown stronger, and now I had something to back up my suspicions. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, or that I was just being paranoid. I had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. With that realization came a new sense of determination. I was going to find out what was really going on, even if I had to take matters into my own hands. After that unsettling moment in Tom's room, and the way Jessica had brushed off my concerns, I knew I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. The nagging feeling in my gut told me something was off, that there were things happening behind my back that I had to uncover. It wasn't just about the laundry anymore. It was about the strange distance between Jessica and me, the way they both seemed to close ranks whenever I tried to get close. I felt like a stranger in my own home, and I couldn't stand it. So I decided that if they weren't going to give me answers, I'd have to find them myself. I had to know the truth, and I was ready to do whatever it took to uncover it. The idea of installing cameras came to me one night as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. It felt drastic, even invasive, but I convinced myself it was the only option left. I'd already tried talking, tried reasoning, but nothing had worked. If anything, my questions only seemed to push them further away. I needed something concrete, proof that could either confirm my suspicions or finally put my mind at ease. So the next day, I went online and ordered a set of small, discreet cameras from AliExpress. They were designed to be hidden, the kind of thing you'd use if you didn't want anyone knowing they were being watched. It felt wrong, but I pushed that feeling down. I had to do this. When the cameras finally arrived, I waited for a day when both Jessica and Tom would be out. Finding a time when the house was empty wasn't easy, but eventually I managed. Opening the box, I could feel my hands trembling slightly as I pulled out the tiny devices. They were smaller than I had imagined, no bigger than a matchbox, and I knew they'd be easy to hide. I started in Tom's room, setting up one of the cameras above his computer desk, angled just right to catch the screen and the area around it. I wanted to know what he was up to, what he was hiding. Then I moved to our bedroom and hid the second camera above the bed, tucking it away among the decoration on the wall. I felt a pang of guilt as I did it, but I pushed it aside. I had to know. The setup took longer than I expected. I had to connect each camera to the Wi-Fi, test the feed, and make sure everything was working properly. As I watched the live feed on my phone, adjusting the cameras, I felt a strange mix of determination and dread. My own face reflected back at me, making it feel even more real. Once everything was set, I sat back and watched the feed for a while, making sure it was working smoothly. The clarity of the video was almost unsettling, every detail of the rooms laid bare in front of me. Over the next few days, I checked the cameras whenever I was away from home. I kept my phone close, glancing at the live feed during my lunch breaks or whenever I had a moment alone. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I watched Jessica go about her day, cleaning or sitting down with a book. Tom was in his room, staring at his computer screen, occasionally typing something or talking on the phone. It all seemed so mundane, so normal, that I began to wonder if maybe I was just being paranoid. But then, every so often, I'd catch something, just a glance between them, or a hushed conversation, that would send my doubts flaring up again. One afternoon, I was at the hardware store picking up supplies when I decided to check the feed. Jessica and Tom were both home, sitting in the living room together. They were talking, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. What caught my attention was the way they were sitting, too close. Their bodies were angled towards each other in a way that felt intimate. My chest tightened, and my grip on the phone grew tense. I wanted to hear what they were saying, to know what was going on between them, but the cameras didn't have audio. All I could do was watch, and the silence only made it worse. It left too much room for my imagination to run wild. The more I watched, the more obsessed I became. Every spare moment I found myself glued to my phone, watching the live feed, waiting for something to happen. It was like I was living two lives. The one where I pretended everything was fine, where I smiled at Jessica and made small talk with Tom, and the other where I was constantly on edge, waiting to catch them in the act. It was exhausting, but I couldn't stop. I needed answers, and I was determined to get them, no matter what it took. I kept telling myself that this was the only way. I had to see for myself what was happening when I wasn't around. I wasn't going to jump to conclusions or let my imagination get the best of me. I just needed to watch, to observe, and to find the truth in whatever small details I could catch on those cameras. I wasn't looking for drama. I just wanted clarity, and I wasn't going to rest until I had it. It wasn't long after installing the cameras that I began to notice certain patterns. The way Jessica and Tom would unlock their phones, the rhythm of their fingers tapping over the screen. I knew what I was about to do was crossing another line, but at this point, I had already committed to finding out the truth. The cameras gave me a partial picture, but it wasn't enough. I needed to know what they were saying, what they were hiding. So I watched the footage closely, replaying it again and again until I had memorized their PIN codes. It felt wrong, intrusive even, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to do it. I had to know what was really happening. One evening, when Jessica was taking a bath and Tom was out, I finally had my chance. I grabbed Jessica's phone from the table and unlocked it, my heart racing in my chest. I started scrolling through her messages, expecting to find nothing. At first, everything seemed completely normal, just messages with friends and family, nothing that raised any suspicion. But then I stumbled across her chat with Tom. It wasn't obvious at first, but the more I read, the clearer it became. They were talking about things they had done while I was away. Their tone was casual, but almost conspiratorial, like they were in on some secret. There were mentions of keeping things quiet, of making sure I never found out. My chest tightened as I kept reading. It wasn't anything explicit, but the message was unmistakable. They were hiding something from me, something significant. I put the phone back before Jessica could notice, my mind spinning. I felt like I was going to throw up. The weight of what I had just uncovered settled on me like a ton of bricks. But I still needed more. I had to be sure. Later that night, when Tom had fallen asleep, I decided to check his phone too. I crept into his room, grabbed his phone off the nightstand, and used the PIN I'd memorized. The messages I found there were worse than anything I could have imagined. Tom had been bragging to his friends about how he was fooling me, about how easy it was to keep me in the dark while I was away. The way he spoke about me was cruel, mocking me for being so oblivious. I had always tried to be a good father figure to Tom, to support him, to be there for him through everything. Reading those messages felt like a slap in the face. It hurt in a way I didn't know I could be hurt. He talked about how they had everything under control, how they managed to keep me out of their plans, how they'd been covering their tracks. It was exactly what I feared. They were deceiving me, together. They had formed some kind of alliance against me. I put the phone back, my hands trembling, and left the room. The pain in my chest felt almost unbearable. The next day, I kept up my surveillance. I needed to understand the full extent of what was going on, and I couldn't stop now. Every chance I got, I checked their messages, Jessica's and Tom's. They were careful, but not careful enough. The messages were filled with vague references to things they would do when I was gone. Little inside jokes that made it clear I was the outsider, the one who didn't belong. It was like I was seeing a completely different side of them, one they had been hiding from me all along. The trust I thought I had in Jessica, the bond we shared, was crumbling with each message I read. I noticed how they communicated too. Whenever they needed to discuss something private, they switched to messaging, avoiding open conversation. It was calculated, a way to keep things from me. They spoke about keeping the house the way they liked it when I was gone, about making sure everything looked normal when I came back. It was clear now, they had a whole separate life when I wasn't around, a life that didn't include me, and as the realization sank in, I felt hollow, like everything I'd worked for was nothing more than an illusion. The more I uncovered, the more my emotions bounced between anger and deep hurt. I wanted to confront them, demand answers, but I knew I couldn't be rash. If I confronted them without solid proof, they'd just deny everything and make me look paranoid. I had to be patient, gather more evidence, and wait for the right moment. Pretending everything was fine was the hardest part. Smiling, acting like I didn't know what was going on behind my back. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I was overreacting, but then I would reread the messages. I would see the way they spoke about me, and the doubt would disappear. This wasn't just my imagination. They were deceiving me, and they were doing it with a level of coordination that I couldn't ignore. I couldn't let it go on like this. I had to take control, but for now, I had to keep playing the role of the oblivious husband, watching and waiting for the right moment to act. Every day that passed, the weight of the truth pressed down on me. I had the proof now, but I had to be careful. When I finally confronted them, I had to make sure there was no escape for them. No way for them to twist the truth. So I kept watching, kept collecting evidence, kept pretending everything was normal. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was the only way to get the answers I needed. After everything I had uncovered, I knew I had to take the next step. The messages, the secrecy, the behavior. It all pointed to something that needed to be confirmed. No more doubts. I came up with a plan. I told Jessica I had to leave for work, that I'd been called into the office for an urgent matter. It wasn't unusual for me to have to go on short notice, so she didn't question it. I saw something in her eyes. Relief, maybe. But I kept my expression neutral. I needed her to think everything was normal. The plan was simple. I'd leave the house for the day, leaving Jessica and Tom behind. I made sure the cameras were running, connected, and ready to record everything. The thought of spying on them this way felt wrong, but I pushed it down. I needed proof, and this was the only way to get it. I left that morning, my heart pounding as I drove away. I parked a few blocks from the house, close enough to return quickly if I needed to, but far enough that they wouldn't notice. I sat in my car watching the feed from the cameras. The house was quiet at first, Jessica moving around in the kitchen, cleaning up after breakfast while Tom stayed in his room. Everything seemed normal. For a moment I wondered if I'd been wrong. But then things started to change. I watched as Jessica went to Tom's room, knocked softly before opening the door. The way she looked at him, the way she smiled, it wasn't right. My chest tightened as I watched, unable to look away. They spoke for a moment, their voices too quiet for me to hear. And then Jessica stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. My heart was pounding so hard I could hardly breathe. I watched as they got closer, as their bodies seemed to draw together. It felt like watching a car crash in slow motion. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even though every part of me wanted to. The way they touched, the way they looked at each other, it confirmed everything I had feared. It was happening right in front of me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Anger, betrayal, sadness. Those emotions swirled inside me, but there was also a strange sense of grim satisfaction. This was what I needed. This was the proof I couldn't ignore, the evidence that would make it impossible for them to lie their way out of. I recorded everything, saving the footage to my phone. It was hard to watch, but I had to. It was harder than I ever could have imagined, but I forced myself to keep going. I had to have something concrete, something undeniable. The proof was right there, and I knew that when the time came, they wouldn't be able to talk their way out of what they had done. As the day wore on, I kept my eyes locked on the screen, unable to look away. Every time I thought I had seen enough, something would pull me back in. It wasn't just about catching them in the act anymore. It was about understanding how deep this had gone, how completely they had betrayed me. The way they spoke to each other, the way they laughed and whispered, made it clear that this wasn't a brief lapse in judgment. No, this had been going on for a long time, longer than I'd ever imagined. The realization hit me like a sucker punch to the stomach, but I couldn't break down. Not yet. I had to stay focused. Eventually, Jessica left Tom's room, her expression calm and satisfied. She went right back to her routine like nothing had changed, like nothing had happened at all. Watching her, I felt a sickening wave of nausea wash over me. The ease with which she slipped back into her role as my wife, it was like looking at a stranger, a person who could smile, lie, and act as if nothing was amiss without even blinking. I knew that when I walked back into that house, she would greet me with the same smile, as though nothing had shifted. The thought of it made my skin crawl, but I kept watching, kept recording. By the end of the day, I had everything I needed. The footage was saved to my phone, an undeniable record of their betrayal. I sat in my car staring at the screen, feeling an emptiness settle in my chest. I had set out to find the truth, and now that I had it, I wasn't sure what to do next. Part of me wanted to storm back into the house and confront them right then and there, demand answers. But I knew better. Not yet. I had to be smarter about this. I needed to plan my next move carefully. This wasn't just about my feelings anymore. It was about taking back control of my life. I drove home that evening, my mind racing. I could still feel the weight of everything I had seen, and I couldn't shake the thought of what I needed to do next. As I walked through the door, Jessica greeted me with that same smile, just as I had expected. I forced myself to smile back, to act like nothing was wrong. I knew the time for confrontation would come, but not yet. For now, I had to keep playing my part. I had the proof, and that was enough for now. The rest would come in time. After everything I had uncovered, I knew the time had come to put an end to all the lies. I'd spent too long pretending, too long playing the part of the oblivious husband. I couldn't do it anymore. I needed everyone to know the truth, not just Jessica and Tom, but the people who mattered to us, the friends and family who had believed in our life together. I wanted them to see what had really been happening behind closed doors. It wasn't enough to confront Jessica and Tom privately. I needed to make sure there was no way for them to twist the story, no way for them to play the victims. It was time for a public reckoning. I began planning carefully, thinking through every detail. I decided to invite our closest friends and family over, under the pretense of celebrating my upcoming voyage. It was the perfect cover. Everyone knew my work kept me away for long stretches, so it wasn't unusual for us to host a gathering before I left. I made sure to personally call each guest, keeping my voice steady and cheerful as I extended the invitations. I told them it would be a casual get-together, a chance to spend time together before I headed back out to sea. No one suspected a thing. As the day of the gathering drew closer, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was part of me that felt eager, almost excited, at the thought of finally exposing the truth. But there was also a part of me that was terrified of what would happen once everything was out in the open. I knew this would change everything. There would be no turning back once I showed everyone what I had uncovered. It was a terrifying thought, but strangely liberating at the same time. I'd been living in the shadows for too long, and it was time to step into the light, no matter how painful it would be. The day before the gathering, I spent the time preparing the house, making sure everything was in order. I set up the projector in the living room, testing it to ensure it would work without a hitch. I had the footage saved on my phone, ready to be played at the right moment. I rehearsed what I was going to say, how I would build up to the reveal without giving anything away too soon. It had to be perfect. I needed everyone to understand, to feel the betrayal as I had. I wanted them to experience the shock and disbelief I had felt when I first discovered the truth. Jessica and Tom had no idea what was coming. Jessica was busy preparing food for the guests, her usual smile fixed on her face, while Tom helped her, moving around the house as if nothing were wrong. Watching them, my stomach turned, but I kept myself calm. I couldn't afford to let anything slip, not now. I had to keep up the act for just a little longer. Every time Jessica looked at me and smiled, every time Tom made a casual comment, I felt the anger rise, but I swallowed it down. I'd waited this long. I could wait a few more hours. As the guests began to arrive in the early evening, I greeted them at the door, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. I could see the warmth in their eyes, the respect and affection they had for me. It made what I was about to do even harder, but it also steeled my resolve. These people had supported us, had believed in our family. They deserved to know the truth. I watched as they mingled, as Jessica moved through the crowd, laughing and chatting, as if everything were perfect. It was almost surreal, knowing what was about to unfold, knowing that, in just a short while, everything would change. Once everyone had arrived and settled in, I took a deep breath and called for their attention. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood in front of them, trying to keep my voice steady. I thanked them all for coming, for being there to send me off before my next voyage. I spoke about how much their support had meant to me over the years, how grateful I was to have them in my life. Slowly, I began to shift the tone of my words, talking about trust, about the importance of family, about how betrayal can come from the places you least expect. I could see the confusion on their faces, the way they exchanged glances, unsure of where I was headed with this. I then asked everyone to gather around the living room near the couch. The tension in the room was palpable, the sense that something was about to happen hanging in the air. Jessica and Tom stood together, their expressions puzzled, but they followed along with the rest. The moment had arrived. Everything I had prepared for, everything I had been holding inside, was about to come to light. I took another deep breath, looking around the room, meeting the eyes of each friend and family member. I could feel the weight of their trust, their support. They were here because they cared about us, because they believed in the family Jessica and I had built together. I knew that what I was about to show them would shatter that belief, but it wasn't my fault. It was the truth, and they deserved to see it. I reached for my phone and connected it to the projector. My hand was steady despite the turmoil inside me. The room fell into a heavy silence, an expectant hush settling over the crowd as they waited to see what I had to reveal. I spoke slowly, deliberately, as I introduced the footage. I explained that I had begun to suspect things weren't as they seemed, that there had been deceit and betrayal where there should have been trust and love. I could see the confusion on their faces, the way they exchanged uncertain glances as they tried to make sense of my words. Jessica stood off to the side, her face growing pale as the realization began to settle in. Tom stood next to her, looking uneasy, his eyes darting around the room. I pressed play, and the footage came to life on the screen. The room was eerily quiet as the footage played. I watched as the faces of our friends and family shifted from confusion to shock, then disbelief. The silence was broken only by the quiet hum of the projector. The images on the screen told a story that needed no words. I saw Jessica's face go from pale to ashen, her eyes widening in horror as she understood what was happening. Tom stood frozen, his gaze glued to the screen, his face a mask of shock. There was no denying it now, no way to twist the story or pretend that everything was fine. The truth was there for everyone to see, laid bare in the most undeniable way possible. Gasps filled the room, followed by murmurs of disbelief. The betrayal was clear, the intimacy between Jessica and Tom undeniable. It was one thing to hear rumors or suspect something, but it was another to see it with your own eyes. I could see the hurt, the confusion on the faces of our friends and family, the way they looked at Jessica and Tom.